Imagine setting out on a journey, only to be caught in a storm so fierce you're forced to seek shelter wherever you can. For Daniel, Amara, and Chidi, that refuge comes in the form of an old railway station, long forgotten by time. The rain falls in torrents, cutting off any way back, and the night feels darker than it should. What seems like a stroke of luck, a roof over their heads, quickly turns ominous as they step inside. The air is thick with decay, the walls stained with mildew, and the wooden floors creak underfoot. Dust blankets every surface, as if no one has set foot there for years. Outside, the storm rages on, but within, a heavy silence lingers, broken only by the faint sound of their footsteps. As they move deeper into the station, an uneasy feeling settles over them, and Mrs. Ez, the elderly woman who joined them on the road, stands apart, her eyes filled with a strange knowing. This station isn't just a place to wait out the storm. It's a place that holds secrets, the kind that once you uncover, there's no turning back.
The rain fell in sheets, a torrential downpour that pounded the windshield with unrelenting force. The rhythmic slap of the wipers was barely enough to keep the view clear as Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white from the tension. At 38, Daniel was a man with sharp, angular features softened only slightly by the beginnings of age creeping into his face. His skin was a light caramel brown, contrasting against the dark blue of his soaked hoodie and the black jeans he wore. His close-cropped hair and neatly trimmed beard gave him an air of meticulousness, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion from years of late nights and long drives. Beside him sat Amara, 32, a journalist with a sharp intellect and a keen eye for detail. Her large, almond-shaped eyes scanned the road ahead, though they could barely see beyond the wall of rain. She had smooth, mocha-toned skin and wore her natural curls pulled back into a bun, exposing her sharp jawline. Dressed in a long, olive-green trench coat over a turtleneck and dark jeans, she was practical, professional, and always prepared for any situation. Yet the storm unnerved her. "We can't drive in this, Daniel. We need to stop," she urged, her voice steady but firm. Daniel nodded, searching for shelter. That's when he spotted it, a dark, shadowy silhouette of an old railway station at the edge of the forest. It stood as a forgotten relic from a different time, its once grand structure now decayed, cloaked in mist and mystery. With a quick decision, Daniel turned off the road and headed toward the station, tires slipping on the wet gravel. Pulling into the station's parking lot, they weren't alone. Another car was already there, and as they parked, the door of the second vehicle opened. Chidi, a 28-year-old IT professional, stepped out, shaking the rain from his black hoodie. His skin was the color of deep mahogany, and his tall, lean frame moved with a quiet grace, though his face held a constant expression of mild apprehension. His dreadlocks were pulled into a low ponytail, and he wore a pair of dark jeans and sneakers. He clutched his phone in one hand, though it was useless in the storm. "Man, this is the last place I want to be stranded," Chidi muttered as he glanced at the station's looming entrance. As the three travelers gathered under the station's awning, the rain pouring down behind them, the last figure emerged from the mist. Mrs. E's, 68, moved slowly, her frail form leaning heavily on a cane. She wore a simple, rain-soaked wrapper, her once white headscarf now stained with age and dirt. Her ebony skin was weathered with wrinkles, her eyes sunken but sharp. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if each step was calculated. Her small, hunched frame seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of sorrows, but her eyes held a strange, knowing glint. "You shouldn't have come here," Mrs. E's murmured, her voice low and almost lost in the wind. The others didn't hear her. The travelers entered the old railway station, grateful to escape the storm, though something about the place immediately felt wrong. The building was old, its walls stained with mildew and dust. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the wooden floorboards creaked beneath their feet. Long benches lined the walls, covered in a thin layer of dust, as if untouched for decades. Faded timetables still hung on the walls, the paper yellowed and curling at the edges, with dates from years long gone. A single lantern flickered weakly from the ceiling, casting long shadows that danced across the room. The smell of damp wood and decay filled the air, but it was the silence that was most unnerving. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, it felt as though time had stopped. At first, the travelers settled in, shaking off the rain and trying to make the best of their unexpected stop. Chitty sat on one of the benches, scrolling through his phone in frustration, though the storm had killed all reception. Amara stood near the windows, watching the rain, while Daniel paced the room, restless. It was Daniel who first heard the whispers. He was leaning against the wall, rubbing his temples, when a faint voice drifted through the air. It was so soft that at first he thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. But the voice grew clearer, more distinct, until he could hear it unmistakably. Daniel, his heart skipped a beat, and he spun around, eyes wide. No one was there. The others were still absorbed in their own thoughts, unaware of the sound. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up his spine. He didn't mention it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the station wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. Across the room, Amara felt a chill crawl down her neck. She wasn't one to scare easily, but there was something about this place that made her uneasy. As she stared out the window, the fog seemed to swirl in strange patterns, almost like figures moving in the mist. She leaned closer, squinting, trying to make sense of it. That's when she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the fog, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she blinked, but when she looked again, the figure was gone. "What the hell?" she whispered to herself, her investigative instincts kicking in despite the fear curling in her gut. She scanned the fog again, but there was nothing. Then there was Chitty. He was still fiddling with his phone, trying to find a signal, when the device suddenly buzzed in his hand. A message flashed on the screen, though he hadn't received a text in hours. It was only one word: run. Chitty's heart pounded in his chest. He stared at the screen, his throat dry. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as a glitch. But then another message appeared. This time, it was a photo, an old black and white image of a woman standing on the train tracks, her back turned to the camera. Beneath the image, the message read, "She never left." Chitty's blood ran cold. He stood abruptly, holding out his phone to the others. "Guys, you need to see this." But when Amara and Daniel looked at the phone, the screen was blank. The messages, the photo, everything was gone. Chitty blinked in confusion, his heart still racing. "I swear it was right there." Mrs. Ease, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, her frail hands gripping her cane, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but carried the weight of years. "This station, it remembers." The others turned to her, their confusion evident. "What are you talking about?" Amara asked, her brow furrowed. Mrs. Ease's eyes were wide, haunted by memories she had tried to forget. Many years ago, there was an accident here. A train, full of passengers, derailed just after midnight. The station closed after that, but the dead, they never left. This place, it's cursed. The souls that were lost in that crash, they're still waiting. As the night dragged on, the station's true nature began to reveal itself. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Shadows danced in the corners of the room, figures that weren't there before. And each of the travelers was confronted with their own personal demons. Daniel, who had always prided himself on being rational, began to hear the voice of his father. His father, a stern man with a deep voice, had passed away years ago, but their relationship had always been strained. As Daniel walked through the dimly lit station, he saw him, standing in the far corner, wearing the same clothes from the day they last argued. His father's eyes were filled with anger, his voice a low growl as he accused Daniel of abandoning him in his final days. "You left me," the apparition hissed. "You weren't there." Amara, meanwhile, found herself standing in a pool of water. At first, she thought it was just a leak from the storm, but the water kept rising, covering her feet, then her ankles. It was cold, freezing, and the sound of water filled her ears, drowning out everything else. She gasped for air, panic rising in her chest. The memory of nearly drowning as a child flooded her mind. and she scrambled onto one of the benches, clutching at her throat as though she could still feel the water closing in. Chitty's phone buzzed again. This time, the messages were more urgent, more terrifying. "Leave now." The woman from the photo appeared again. Only this time, she was closer, her face visible, gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared right through him. The message beneath it read, "She waits for you." And then there was Mrs. E's. The frail old woman sat with her eyes closed, whispering to herself, rocking back and forth on the bench. "I shouldn't have left her," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I should have stayed." Amara, fighting her own fear, approached Mrs. E's, kneeling beside her. "Who are you talking about?" Tears streamed down Mrs. E's face as she opened her eyes. "My daughter, she was on that train." She began to tell them the station's dark history, her voice low and somber. Many years ago, a train had derailed here at the stroke of midnight. Dozens of passengers had died, their bodies trapped in the wreckage for days before they were found. After the tragedy, the station was closed, but strange things began to happen. People spoke of hearing whispers in the dead of night, of seeing the shadows of those who had died walking the tracks, forever waiting for the train that never arrived. Mrs. E's story brought them together. She revealed that her daughter had been one of the victims of the train derailment. Ever since, the station had haunted her dreams, calling her back. In a flash of insight, Amara pieced together that the derailment had not been an accident. A journal found in the station master's office, long hidden under dust, revealed a terrifying truth. The station master had gone mad, believing that a supernatural force demanded of sacrifice to appease the restless spirits who were trapped in the station from an earlier, lesser-known incident. The derailment was his doing, a gruesome attempt to satisfy the ghosts that haunted him. The atmosphere thickened with tension. The more the travelers tried to ignore the supernatural occurrences, the more aggressive the haunting became. Doors slammed shut on their own, objects were thrown across the room, and the whispers turned into screams. It was clear now, the station wasn't just haunted by the dead. Something darker was at play. Each of them faced their deepest fears in this fight for survival. Daniel stood up to the ghostly image of his father, finally forgiving himself for their unresolved past. Amara found the courage to face the phantom waters, grounding herself in the present and recognizing the illusions for what they were. Chitty, shaken by his personal trauma, found strength in the realization that he was not responsible for the death of his friend, as the apparitions tried to convince him otherwise. Mrs. E's, however, knew what she had to do. She had come back to the station for a reason. She believed that her daughter was still trapped here, and now she had a chance to set her free. Then, the station master appeared. His form was twisted and grotesque, a shadow of the man he once was. His uniform hung in tatters from his skeletal frame, and his eyes glowed with a sinister light. He moved with unnatural speed, appearing and disappearing in flashes of darkness. The air around him was thick with malice as he confronted the group. "You shouldn't have come here," the station master growled, his voice echoing through the room. "This is my station, and you're never leaving." Daniel stood his ground, though his heart pounded in his chest. "We didn't mean to disturb you," he said, his voice trembling. "We just needed shelter." The station master's laugh was cold, sending chills down their spines. "You think you could just walk away? No one leaves, not after they've seen what you've seen." The travelers were trapped, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. The station master's laughter faded into the eerie silence of the room. The flickering lantern above cast distorted shadows on the walls, making it difficult to tell what was real and what was a figment of their overworked minds. Daniel, Amara, Chitty, and Mrs. E's stood frozen, eyes wide with terror. But deep down, each of them knew there was no easy way out. The old station master's figure hovered menacingly at the far end of the room, half hidden in the dark. His gaunt face was pale, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. His uniform, though tattered, still bore the insignia of the old railway, and his hand clutched a broken pocket watch, its ticking faint but maddeningly constant. Amara's investigative instincts kicked in, trying to make sense of the horror unfolding before her. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, her voice firm despite the fear gripping her. Her dark curls, now damp from the storm, clung to her face, but her sharp, intelligent eyes gleamed with a mixture of defiance and curiosity. The station master sneered, his voice raspy and low. "It's not about what I want. It's about what they want." He gestured behind him, and suddenly, the shadows in the room began to take shape. Ghostly figures of men, women, and children who had once been passengers on the ill-fated train. Their faces were pale and gaunt, eyes wide with terror, as if they were reliving their final moments over and over again. Mrs. Ease, her frail hands trembling, gasped as she saw a familiar face among the ghosts. It was her daughter, a beautiful young woman in her early 20s, with ebony skin and delicate features. Her once vibrant eyes now stared blankly, lost in the endless torment of the afterlife. Mrs. Ease let out a heart-wrenching sob, sinking to her knees. "Neka," she whispered. "Oh God, what have I done?" Chitty, the youngest of the group, stood by the door, his breath coming in short gasps. His dark eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but the door that had once been their way out was now sealed shut. His phone buzzed again, and he glanced down to see another message, this one more terrifying than before. "She's coming for you, Chitty." He dropped the phone in panic. The message burned into his mind. The woman from the photograph, the ghost with the hollow eyes, was now only a few feet away from him, her translucent form hovering just above the ground. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, her empty eyes seemed to scream for justice, for release. Amara, ever the logical one, took a deep breath and looked at Daniel. His tall, muscular frame seemed rigid, like a coiled spring ready to snap. His brown skin glistened with sweat, and his normally calm, sharp eyes were clouded with fear. But something in him had shifted. His resolve hardened. "We can't let this thing control us," he said, his voice firm. "There's got to be a way to stop this." Amara's mind raced. "It's not the station master," she muttered, piecing the puzzle together. "It's the spirits, the ones trapped here, the ones from the crash. They're the key. They want something from us, maybe closure, maybe forgiveness." Mrs. Ease, still on her knees, sobbed quietly. "It's my fault," she wept. "I left her to die. I left my daughter on that train. I couldn't get to her in time." Daniel crouched down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's not your fault, ma'am. Whatever happened that night, it wasn't your doing." The station master, watching from the shadows, let out another eerie laugh. "Fault doesn't matter here. The past is the past. But the dead, they never forget." Suddenly, the station's walls began to close in, the floorboards creaking ominously as if the very building itself was alive. The ghosts began to grow more restless, their moans filling the air. The travelers could feel the icy chill of death creeping closer with every passing second. The station master's voice grew louder, more insistent, as he circled them like a predator stalking its prey. "You can't escape. You are all part of this now." But Daniel wasn't ready to give up. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared as he faced the station master head-on. "We're not part of anything. We're just passing through." His voice carried strength, but his mind raced. They needed to find a way to break the curse, to free the souls trapped in the station. Amara, her sharp mind working furiously, suddenly had an idea. "The pocket watch," she said, pointing to the station master's hand. "It's broken, but it's still ticking. What if that's the source of all this?" Chitty, though shaken, nodded in agreement. "Makes sense. Maybe the watch is what's keeping the spirits bound to this place. What's keeping them stuck in the past." The station master growled, his bony fingers clutching the watch tighter. "You think you can destroy it? This watch holds their time. Without it, they will be lost forever. And so will you." Amara stepped forward, her heart pounding. "They're already lost," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But we don't have to be." Before the station master could react, Daniel lunged forward, grabbing the watch from his hand. The cold, ghostly figure hissed in rage as Daniel held the pocket watch aloft. The ticking grew louder, more frantic, as if the very fabric of time was unraveling. Mrs. Ease, still clutching her cane, slowly rose to her feet. Her tear-streaked face was set with grim determination. "My daughter," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Neka. I'm so sorry." With a final, desperate cry, Daniel slammed the watch against the floor, shattering it into pieces. The sound of broken glass echoed through the station, and for a moment, everything went still. The ghosts froze, their hollow eyes staring blankly at the travelers. And then, one by one, they began to disappear, fading into the mist, their tortured souls finally finding peace. The end. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the captivating mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling story like this. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think the travelers should do to prevent others from falling prey to the station's haunting whispers? Share your ideas in the comments below, and let's see who can come up with the best plan to protect future visitors from the station's eerie fate.